Hello everyone, no matter where you are watching in on this. Mara and I send our greetings from Camarma, Spain. Camarma is a small city of 6,000 people, about 20 miles east of Madrid, and we are currently staying in a missionary guest house here. We're safe and sound. We have access to a grocery store and pharmacy, and we're doing fine, thanks be to God. And thank you, so many of you have reached out and are praying for us, have asked for prayer, and we also want to know how we can be praying for you. A friend from Mexico wrote us yesterday and says, I just know that, just for you to know that I'm praying for you because you're in the eye of the storm. And in a sense we are, although this is a crazy storm that we're in, that has many eyes. The first one being in China, another one and still is in Iran. Another huge eye of the storm is in northern Italy, now Madrid and all of Spain, but half of what's going on in Spain is going on in Madrid, half of the infections and half of the fatalities. And now we see another eye of the storm burgeoning in New York City. I've also heard that Detroit, New Orleans, everywhere. This is a unprecedented time that we're living in, and it's a time that all of us, perhaps some people are asking, well, where's God in all of this? And why is this happening? And who do we turn to? Where do we go? Life is full of storms. I remember growing up in Iowa. Iowa, of course, is part of Tornado Alley, and we have a lot of storms, and we'd always first panic when we would see the tornado watch, and then a lot of those watches turned into tornado warnings, and then all of us would head to the cellar to seek protection. And tornadoes, they fortunately never hit our farm, but they certainly hit other places. There's a story I want to share from the book of Acts about the Apostle Paul and a storm that he encountered. And found in chapter 27 of the book of Acts. We don't have time to read the whole thing, but I encourage you to read this. But we find this particular storm, just to sum up, Paul has been arrested in Jerusalem. He was then taken to Caesarea, where he spent 2 years under house arrest, and then because he appealed then to give testimony, he appealed his case to Caesar. Then it was arranged the Roman guards and took him on this village, on this passageway to Rome. And of course, the story in Acts 27, Paul is on a ship. They've made it to Crete, and then there was some debate at that time whether to go on or to stop. Paul tried to convince them to stop and spend the winter there, but the ship, the captain and so forth, they sailed on. And so we find this very intriguing and very emotional story in Acts 27, a ship of 276 people on board. Luke is with them writing, because he writes in the first person. And we just see what is happening here. They started out fine, leaving from Crete. It said it was a very peaceful, and they thought everything was going well for them. But then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, came this huge windstorm they called the Northeasterner, and it just created havoc with them. And one thing led to another, and things went from bad to worse. And we read that later they spent 2 weeks without daylight, and just everyone was assured that the ship was going to go down. We read just a short passage of this in verses 21 through 26, and Luke is writing here again, Acts 27. It says, "And after the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, 'Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God whose I am and who I serve stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God, and it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. We know that from history then that island happened to be what is now Malta. But we read in this scripture going on after this that they were going on. Paul says that, yet I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. And then we run, it says, and fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. Now, if we had a time machine, if we happened to be there, I don't know that any of us can really relate to what was going on here. Being at the sea, being in a terrible storm that lasted for 2 weeks, not even seeing the light of day, and yet they decide to let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. They knew that they were getting in shallower water and that they needed to put down what anchors do. They put down your roots and to keep you firm. They keep you from going off adrift. I'd like to take some liberty with this text and suggest that there are 4 anchors. There could be a lot more, but just to choose 4 anchors that I believe that we need to let down into the sea of this storm that we're currently in and other storms that will come along. We read in the book of Hebrews a fascinating verse that talks about the anchor of our faith. It goes like this. In Hebrews 6:19 we read, "We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain." So these 4 anchors that I'm going to talk about in this first session, I'm just going to talk about the first one. But these anchors are: 1, God's presence. The second one is God's peace. The third is God's power and his protection. And the fourth is God's promises. And specifically, I want to be talking about the promise of eternal life. But in this first session, we're just going to have time to talk about this first anchor. And I really think it's probably the most important of the 4, and that is God's presence. It's interesting here in this passage that, Paul had been reassured many different times throughout his missionary work of God's presence. We know that God first appeared to him on the road to Damascus in his conversion. Later, when he was undecided about which way to go, he had a vision from the man of Macedonia, making it very clear which way he should go. We read later when he was in the city of Corinth that he was reassured by God that God had many people in that city and that no harm would come to him there. And here I can imagine that Paul welcomed this visit from the angel that night that the angel came to them and said, "Paul, just want you to know you're going to be okay, and you and all the ship's crew and every passenger on the ship is going to make it all right." And I have no doubt that Paul was reassured by God's presence there with him through the angel on that night when he spoke to him. In the year 1901, some of you have heard of the great British explorer Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton. He wrote a book about this famous expedition south. It's a fascinating book, an account of what these men, I think there were about 80 altogether, who the mission was to go to Antarctica and then to make an expedition across on land to the South Pole, the first ones to do this. But disaster struck their ship called the Endurance. It was later crushed by ice, and Shackleton and his men had to literally, it was an incredible story of their survival, that finally they were on the sheets of ice for months until they reached Elephant Island, and from there Shackleton and 2 others, they went in by a drop ship, a boat, a survival boat, and made it over to South Georgia Island. Listen to what Shackleton wrote in his diary. I don't know for sure of his spiritual condition, whether he believed in God or knew God, but this is a fascinating story from his diary. Shackleton said, "When I look back at those days, I have no doubt that Providence guided us, not only across those snowfields, but across the storm-white sea that separated Elephant Island from our landing place on South Georgia. I know that during that long and racking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers of South Georgia Island, it seemed to me that often that we were 4, not 3. I said nothing to my companions on the point, but afterwards Worsley, one of his companions, said to me, 'Boss, I had a curious feeling on the march that there was another person with us.'" Creon confessed to the same idea. One feels the dearth of human words, the roughness of mortal speech, in trying to describe things intangible. But a record of our journeys would be incomplete without a reference to a subject very near to our hearts. I am moved by this story. Here are these 3 explorers going across just amazing difficulties in getting to this place of safety, a journey of 36 hours, and every one of them felt that there was someone else with them. Perhaps they felt like the 3 Hebrew children who were thrown into the fiery furnace. And then the king of Babylon looks in and he declares, "Did we not throw 3 into the furnace? Why is it that I see 4? And the 4th appears as one of the sons of God. I'm reminded of the story of the disciples in the boat with Jesus. The storm blew up, another storm. And the disciples panicked, and if we were in that boat, we would probably also. But they forgot that Jesus was with them in the boat. They forgot that he was there with them. I oftentimes wonder what would have happened if they hadn't gone to wake him up. What would have happened? Would the storm have continued to rage? I think everything would have been fine. But if you and I are anything like those disciples, we probably would have gone and woken up Jesus. And Jesus then gave them something even stronger to fear about than the storm, because he stood up, he calmed the wind and the waves. And usually in normal circumstances, after a storm will die down, the wind stops, but the sea does not stop. The waves continue to rage and die down after several minutes. But in this case, the waves immediately stopped, the wind immediately stopped, and the disciples were astonished because Jesus, what he had done. You and I need to remember that in these days of this storm, that Jesus is in the boat with us. A lot of people ask, well, where is Jesus? Where's God in the midst of all of this? And my answer is, he's right here with us all along. He's with every person. He's with every person in the hospitals, every person at home. Many of us, like us, are under lockdown. Jesus is in the boat with us. Tim Keller, one of my favorite Bible teachers, said once, God has a celebration mean with us, not after we finally get out of the dark valley, but in the middle of it, in the presence of our enemies. He wants us to rejoice in him in the midst of our troubles. And so in the middle of this storm that's called COVID-19, my prayer for myself and all of you is to remember that God is with us, that we would let down this great anchor of God's presence in our lives. We have this great anchor of faith. Jesus said that he would never leave us nor abandon us. Let's hang on to that. In the next session, I'll talk about the second anchor, the anchor of God's peace. May God bless you in these days.